Welcome to the Thesis 11 public lecture. This is actually the last public performance of a week of events involving Pam Delagi and Craig Calhoun, and we're absolutely delighted to have them back with us. In 2005 was the last time that Craig was here, and we were very pleased to say that nothing happened. Perhaps I should add one more word to that sentence. Nothing untoward happened, because Craig and Pam have this remarkable capacity to be actually living presence to major world crises, revolutions and disasters. They were present for the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989. They were present for the Eritrean independence struggle uprising in 1993. And Craig was having breakfast with his parents across the road from the World Trade Center in 9/11. So we were very relieved that when he came to La Trobe, nothing actually happened in any world significance. But of course, we were greatly beneficiary of his extraordinary learning and range and capacious mind for thinking about matters that matter to us all, irrespective of where we live in these times. I shouldn't have to read out this formal introduction, but for the benefit of viewers and it's going on the web, let me say formally that Craig Calhoun is the president of the Los Angeles-based Berggruen Institute, which works globally to advance cross-cultural understanding, improve governance, and deepen knowledge of great transformations shaping the human future. Calhoun was previously director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he remains Centennial Professor, and before that, he was president of the New York-based Social Science Research Council and university professor of social sciences and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. His books have been translated into 18 languages and include Does Capitalism Have a Future? 2013, The Roots of Radicalism, 2012, and Nations Matter, 2007. And for those of you that participated in the masterclass, you'll know that that's a very, very small selection of the great range of books that he has written, co-authored, or edited. The Nations Matter book predicted rising nationalist and populist challenges to cosmopolitanism grounded in a highly unequal global economy. And it's just this theme that we attend to tonight. Thank you, Craig, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Trevor, in particular, and my thanks to Peter Beilhartz and to all of the Thesis 11 team, not just for the invitation to be here, but for decades of intellectual stimulation and challenge. And I always thought La Trobe University mainly was Thesis 11. But I gather that the university has a broader understanding of itself now, and I've noticed that. But the Thesis 11 is, as I think you probably all know, a globally significant journal and intellectual network. And I'd stress the intellectual network part. There are many journals, but very few of those journals have animated over the years the kind of international engagements with different intellectual communities that have been a mainstay of Thesis 11, the journal, and the Thesis 11 Centre at La Trobe. So for a very long time, in my case since about 1991, this has been an important part of the intellectual world as I see it, rooted here in Melbourne, in Bundoora really. And the journal has continued since 1980, so it's actually quite a survivor and a success story in its own right. And it's a pleasure to be here on the anniversary of La Trobe University's founding and in the presence of its most distinguished intellectual achievement. Now, I would like to tell you I'm going to talk only about optimistic and positive things, but my topic is nationalism. And so that won't be the whole story. But my story is not all negatives either, so a bit more mixed in various ways. And just to foreshadow the message of the talk, a sort of odd situation here where I may periodically turn around and look to say what slide is up there as I talk. Just to foreshadow, these are the core messages that I want to try to elaborate in this sense. The first is important. Many people have imagined that because nations weren't working well, because the challenges of globalization put enormous pressures on nations that they couldn't always handle very well with their policies, that nations would somehow fade away, that the nation state would cease to be the primary organizational unit of modern society, of global capitalism, that it has been for the last couple hundred years. I don't think that's true. I think they will continue to have difficulties. For example, they will not be able to set their own fiscal policies very autonomously. The global bond markets and other things will interfere, as Greece learned dramatically in the context of the global financial crisis. But the fact that there are those problems and difficulties will not lead nations to disappear. It will need us to have some extra challenges to solve. Nationalism, I want to say, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and I'll explain a bit more what I mean, but part of what I mean is it's not just present when somebody says something pernicious in politics. It's much more pervasively part of how we inhabit and think the world. That in addition to nationalism as a kind of political ideology about how one nation is better than others or should defend itself with protectionism or something, there is nationalism as a social imaginary or as a discursive formation that just shapes how we see and feel the world. I'll speak about that. It, in my view, helps to constitute the modern world. It's not an extra that you could just easily pull out. It is a core part of how our world is organized. But at the same time, it biases and distorts how we see the world. It's not a realistic photograph of the world. It is something that shapes the world in certain ways and sometimes pushes or distorts our reality. And nationalism is not something that we just have to put up with. It's something we can struggle to make work better. We can make our countries work better. We can make our patriotism and loyalty to our countries productive of better ways of being themselves, better ways of being in the world. We should think of our countries, of national identities, as a project, not an inheritance. A commonplace of many nationalist ideologues is to present the nation as an inheritance. This is what we got from the great heroes of past military struggles, from our independence movement, from the literary lions who made the great achievements of our culture. We got it from the past and we have to take care of it. We have to protect it. Right? What I want to suggest is we need to be a little bit more like those past figures and try to keep making it. That nations can be projects in which we seek to make them better nations, both for themselves internally and for the whole world externally. So if we think about them as projects rather than just inheritances, we have a better way to approach living in a largely national world and dealing with nationalism. Now, to deal with all of this, we have to start by overcoming some illusions. And I'm going to just outline a few of them, but there are lots of illusions that are encouraged by the pervasive way in which nationalist thinking has shaped the modern social imaginary. And I think that we can't just get rid of all of them. We can't just wish all this away instantly. But we can reflexively and self-critically look at some of the ways in which our habits of mind may be shaped by versions of nationalism that we could in fact reform or move away from in all of this. So we can think critically, historically, and comparatively. These are our buzzwords. Everybody in the Thesis 11 community says critical, historical, and comparative before breakfast every day. But they mean something particular in this context because it is a feature of nationalism that we tend to narrate our national stories as though they were sufficient unto themselves. And we tend to think that what's going on in our national context is distinctively about it, and miss the extent to which the same things may have gone on in other time periods or in other places. And that includes right now, where the renewal of nationalist politics is in fact a global renewal of nationalist politics, particularly prominent in some places, but not really missing from any part of the world entirely. And so if we think it's all just local causes. If Australian nationalism and the various proponents of nationalism and so-called populism had only Australian reasons behind them, that would be odd, because the same sort of things are being suggested in Britain and France and the United States and a variety of other places. So it's important that we look at the world even when we want to think about ourselves. And we need to recognize that there's a lot of reinforcement of what I'm calling this social imaginary, or this discursive formation, from various sources, including people who don't mean to reinforce it. Quick example, right? If you want to go do comparative research, I've said you ought to think comparatively, you will find it's organized in terms of nations by the data sources. You want World Bank data on the world, it comes prepackaged as data about countries. And so you tend methodologically, almost accidentally and automatically, to incorporate a view of the world as made up of nations. If you wanted to say, I think cities are the real area of action, you would not find a comparable data set. If you say the countryside, you'd find even less comparable data, right? So the national organization of things is reinforced by the very ways lots of our data come. International organizations are organized this way, right? The United Nations General Assembly, or things, we have representatives of countries. Lots of what we think of as the international is organized very literally as among nations, international, and not transcending or bypassing or somehow other than nations. So the economy may be something that flows across national borders pretty readily, even disturbingly readily some of the time, but economic statistics don't. They're organized in national terms, right? And universities actually inhabit and produce a lot of this. Go to the International Sociological Association, you'll find representatives of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and Canada, and so forth. And you will find us writing books and studies and doing things in ways that incorporate national perspectives. Not nationalist in the sense that we all say nothing critical about our countries, maybe very critical about features of them, but we just think in terms of them. For sociologists in the room, we tend to think society means the nation, right? Great sociological theorists writing about society often rather uncritically sort of saw society in terms of the nation state. So they saw it, for example, as having boundaries in a way that societies don't exactly have boundaries. They have legal recognition of citizenship, they have borders, right? But the concept of society has absorbed that in a way that isn't true of local society or even international society. So we've got various kinds of academic reproductions as well. The basic point is this isn't a mistake that we can correct easily. If we say, yeah, I don't want to be nationalist anymore, tomorrow you'll wake up and be nationalist again, because it's so pervasively embedded in the way we look at the world. Illusion number one that I want to stress is that nations exist naturally, that they've always been there, right? We sometimes imagine that, but if you think about it, there are no lines and borders in the ground on the world. They've all been drawn historically. They are not a part of the world as it is given to us, if you will. There are mountain ranges and rivers and some things that get incorporated into borders, but the world is available to a much more fluid movement. And in fact, the history of human movement would suggest that moving is as basic a part of history as staying put, and has been going on for a very long time, and produces groupings, but groupings that keep changing fluidly. So when we remake the map of the world as a map of nation states, we have to recognize that the lines between countries are put in place historically. There are various versions of this in colonial countries where the colonial rulers at a distance from the country drew very straight and sharp lines. So, I would just point to the extent to which you look at Western Europe, you see no straight and sharp lines, right? You look at much of Africa, you see a whole variety of straight and sharp lines, which reveal that people at some distance from local geography were deciding, let's put the line here. They often divided tribal and other ethnic groups in two on the borders of these places, helping to create some of the conflicts that came later. So part of what I mean by nationalism is distorting is it makes us think there's something clear and automatic about these green and yellow and blue spaces on the maps, right? When in fact they've been put in place historically. They've sometimes been put in place at odds with how people were living on the ground. They've sometimes mixed up languages. There are all sorts of other things that go on. So that doesn't mean, in my view, that we can wish it away, right? I just said something critical, well-known criticism, of the way colonialism arbitrarily divided up African countries. But the Organization of African Unity and the AU now, the African Union, having said, we need to embrace that. We should not get into a series of efforts to redraw the borders because we will end up in wars and conflicts and it will be unproductive. We need to accept this, even knowing that there was an element of historical arbitrariness to it, because it will be a disaster for Africa if we open the door to an infinite number of secessionist movements or movements to conquer neighbors or all of that. Europe, of course, got its squiggly lines through centuries of warfare. It was not a happy history. The French people were not always French. You know, sometimes if you talk to certain kinds of French people, you will get an impression that back to Asterix the Gaul, there was simply France. It's not true. The borders change, it's nationally unified. There are periods in which certain dukes of Normandy or Burgundy are much more powerful than the King of France. Right? And it's not until the 1850s or 60s that the majority of Frenchmen speak French. Right? There is no point in the history of France before the second half of the 19th century when the majority of Frenchmen speak French. And the majority of French women don't speak French for another generation after that. Okay? So this is a relatively recent phenomenon, everybody speaking French. It has to do with the integration of labor markets. It has to do with the building of transportation and then communications infrastructures. It has to do with the coming of public education and the more or less standardized education throughout the country. There's a historical story that yields France, which is one of the more integrated of the large countries in the world, but not an automatic natural history. The same pretty much for everywhere. So we have often had in scholarship a debate that I think has been unproductive, or at least overstated, between what so-called primordialists and constructivists, which the primordialists say there are these ancient ethnicities that are at the center of nationalism, and the constructivists say, no, it's all been just invented fairly recently. What's unhelpful about this is the idea that there's an either-or, and the failure to recognize that a sense of your country always having been there may be part of your life and growing up in the country, even if the country's only 100 years old, right? That your experience may still be of its omnipresence. On the other side, the invention of traditions isn't a peculiar thing. People will point to the Scottish tartan and say, that's actually a recent invention, which is true. Scots did not all through history where tartans were not clan markers and identified. That's an invented history. But it turns out actually all traditions kind of have to be invented. None of them are natural and just always there. At some point, there is an invention. There is a change in the narration of things. And whether it's a king or a shaman or a teacher or somebody else, the stories have beginnings and they have to get retold, and in the retelling they may be changed. So it's not really as much news as it sounds like to say that national traditions are reinvented. But significant illusion to overcome that they're natural, and we need to just keep that in mind. Right? Second illusion, that there is some obvious answer that makes sense to who are the real members of a nation. And we talk about immigration in ways that imagine we can say, these are the real Australians, there's somebody else. Then we say, we need to include Aboriginals in the real Australians. Well, maybe if we really include Aboriginals, we don't include us. Oops, what happened? And we have in every setting, not just in cases like Australia with a relatively glaring history in relationship to the Aboriginal peoples, but everywhere in the world, an issue about a desire to recognize some people as really belonging, because part of what's valuable and good about nation is a sense of solidarity. And yet, there's no obvious answer. There's no easy way to decide who belongs, because every place is shaped by conquest and or colonialism, by migration, even the slave trade, by ethnic cleansing. We think, that's the former Yugoslavia. And there was this horrible ethnic cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Well, what has been going on in a variety of histories could be counted as ethnic cleansing at different times. And more benignly, just cultural borrowing and innovation, right? We say English is our language. Well, how many words in English were borrowed from Indian languages, or so forth and so on? It's a more complicated picture. We try to standardize, right? And we try to impose order. We write dictionaries. We have whole structures to try to settle what counts as right. We switch to a Chinese example, right? Modern Chinese, oral spoken Chinese, right, is full of a range of different dialects, but the growing dominance of what has been called Mandarin because of its association with the imperial elites. Now, historically, Mandarin was spoken by less than 2% of the population, right? And it was linked to an examination system and a system of rule in the empire that set most of the ordinary Chinese people apart from this version of Chinese. They spoke Cantonese or Fukienese or a variety of so-called dialects, but in Chinese that means mutually unintelligible oral languages, though they are intelligible in writing. It's still the case occasionally at a Chinese meeting that you will see people passing each other notes because they can't speak each other's languages orally. Okay? So to say all Chinese people speak Chinese is to obscure as much as you reveal. They're more likely to write Chinese, but their written Chinese is a product of the Baihua era, 1919 era language reforms that created a simplified modern written Chinese against classical Chinese that was amenable to being put into printing presses so there could be newspapers and made it easier to teach larger numbers of people to read. That's mostly a good story. And the story changes. When you get radio and television, you get more standardization of language and all of this. My point is, it's a historical process that is redefining what it means to speak the Chinese language, which is one of the markers of being Chinese. And we've got a variety of other things that go into each of these stories. So cultural standardization, right, producing a standard version of the language, is an achievement. It's not something that is just there from the start. Nations in this context are made by what they forget as much as anything else. It's really a famous line from Ernst Renan in the middle of the 19th century about the importance of forgetting. And he had in mind a very specific example, which is the upper left corner example. Yes, upper left corner example here, the Huguenots, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, ethnic cleansing, right? France in the 16th century massacres huge numbers of Protestant Frenchmen in order that France be a Catholic country. Many others are driven out and moved to Canada and to Florida and to upstate New York, what are now these different places. We're not yet. Canada didn't exist, of course. So the Huguenots migrate. In migrating, they confront Native Americans, right? And Native Americans who confront Europeans meet a sort of unfortunate fate. Now, the Huguenots are by no means the worst of the Europeans in this. They try in many ways to get along with the Native Americans, the so-called Indians, more than the English do. But nonetheless, the Europeans who are being pushed out in ethnic cleansing programs, often on religious bases, confront Native Americans and push them in various ways. The world is very interconnected in this formation of nationalism. Nations. It's an international process that forges nations. Their process. This is the Académie Française, which among other things is in charge of linguistic standardization of French, so that for a long time you could not, although you now can, say le weekend, right? That is, in maintaining it. And part of the project was maintain it against those borrowed words from other languages, although they've recently decided they can't completely do that, and all that. But the lower right corner is Canadian First Peoples children forcibly removed from families into schools where they were being trained to be Canadian, thinking this was helpful advance. There are Australian stories that are not completely different from this, right? This is to produce Canadian nationals, not natural, right? Produced by sitting in those school desks and learning the discipline as well as the language and the other content of the educational process. Third illusion, that it's only when nationalism is bad and nasty that there's an issue with it. But nationalism, right, is both more benign and more nasty, and we need to think it in a bigger way. These pictures, of course, the Nazis and the attacks on Jews on the right in black and white, this is an American poster about those nasty Germans in World War I. It's not the Nazis that it's criticizing, it's the Kaiser, who is the mad brute that must be destroyed. And this is the first King Kong movie that is being represented, right? In which Fay Wray is being carried off by the brutish gorilla. We represent other nations in these dehumanizing ways. These have long-term ripple effects. We represent ourselves innocent. I could go on in this, but let me just note that it is a very, very common trope of the nastier sort of nationalism to represent foreigners as nasty, overgrown men and them attacking our women. There is a gendered character to almost all these sorts of constructions of nationalism in various ways, and we could go into a discussion of why, how much it has to do with reproduction and the fertility for the future of the nation, how much it has to do with an idea of us being innocent, which is symbolized by the women, and them being aggressors, but there's weak politics. So there are a lot of problems with the nastier sorts of nationalism, right? But nationalism also appears in really more banal, but still powerful ways. Nationalism is not limited to those occasions where it shows up as nasty. In fact, they're all possible partly because it's always already there in these more everyday ways. So that we have the Olympics and parades of the nations in the Olympics with their flags and their different costumes. We have postage stamps, which in a variety of ways celebrate being in our different nations and do work in a nationally organized international postage system, which is echoed in things like the internet address system, right? So every country in the world except the United States, which expresses its now declining hegemony in this way, has a suffix. So that the web addresses all say, right, something like NZ, and you know you're dealing with New Zealand at the end of them, except the US ones, which just say edu or com or org, because the unmarked status of the hegemon is pronounced. But note that this is functional. We're routing. These are addresses. We're sending messages places. But it's also reproducing an idea of what the world is like at the same time. Now, I don't want you to think that I was saying Australia was peculiarly nationalist by including that previous postage stamp. And occasionally there are more interesting examples of the nationalism, like claiming Janis Joplin for American nationalism. What she would make of that, I'm not quite sure, but that is an actual postage stamp. So there's plenty of examples of banal nationalism of all kinds, song contests, all kinds of Olympics, everything like this. Fourth and final illusion that I want to say, which is that nations are in any sense equal. Right? We treat them as equal for diplomatic purposes. And part of the function of nations is to give lots of people chances to have jobs as ambassadors or cabinet ministers or other kinds of important people, right? And almost every nation in the world, interestingly, has almost exactly the same set of those important people jobs. A peculiarity of the world is that the countries organize their cabinet level posts in remarkably similar ways all over the world. Institutional isomorphism, sociologists have called it. They break up the tasks, right? Nobody says, let's have a minister of health who's also the minister of education. Oh no, these are two jobs. Occasionally, right? But you know, if that's possible, impossible to have the minister of the economy also be the minister of education, right? You have a bunch of these different positions, they're different ministries. They look at each other. Part of the story of nationalism is that every country looks at others. Even empires did this before nations, that they don't just invent this inside. There isn't some primordial process in which Australia says, hey, great idea, let's have a minister of health or something, right? There is a looking around. How do they do it in other places? What's going on, right? It's in textbooks, it circulates, right? But it gives the illusion that the similarity is an equality. And the diplomatic recognition, right, An ambassador is an ambassador. There's not sort of ambassadors with 3 stripes and ambassadors with 2 stripes and ambassadors with only 1 stripe because their country's small, right? There is a formal equality. In the United Nations General Assembly, right, it's a one nation, one vote system. Whether you want to call that democracy or not is another question. Now, of course, there is the Security Council, and guess what? The really small countries don't get permanent chairs in the Security Council. But who gets a permanent chair has a politics to its own, right? And there are huge differences among countries. Liechtenstein is not actually the smallest country in the world. San Marino is. But there are, the Maldives. There are a bunch of very small countries which are in very different structural positions. We call them all nation states, and they have the same formal status in the world, but very different capacities to organize their borders, to organize flows of relationships, monetary or otherwise, with others, and some of them are simply enormous, like China. Okay. So equality is a convention. I'm going to assume that's sort of obvious. Sovereignty is also a convention. The idea of sovereignty is not just contentious because we wonder if it's strong or weak. It's contentious as an idea. It's a problematic sort of concept with which to think the greater or lesser autonomy of countries, the ability of them to make decisions on their own. Greece, Spain, to a lesser extent Italy, found out that whatever their nominal sovereignty in political terms, it was not complete sovereignty in economic terms. That, in fact, the international bond market was an arbiter of relative sovereignty. And since most of the purchasers of bonds were abroad and were interested only in what they regarded as their likelihood of being repaid at the appropriate value, that this limited the autonomous capacity to act of governments in those countries. And in general, right, we live in a world where we have unequal abilities to make national policies and make them stick, though we have formal sovereignty among the countries. How this is sorted out is a whole problem. I'm not going to go into any detail about it, but it's significant. Part of the story is that we treat nations as individuals, and the idea of the modern individual and the idea of the modern nation grew up together. And it's an illusion with individuals, right? Individuals are not full sovereigns of ourselves. We have a notion of ourselves running everything for ourselves, but we're influenced by other people. It's a more complicated idea. The United States has a telling invocation of this in a Pledge of Allegiance that celebrates the indivisibility of the country, written shortly after the Civil War, when it looked like it was about to be divided. No, it's indivisible. Almost the same word as individual, right? We have this notion you can't take it apart. It's a whole. Well, the sense in which nations are wholes and the degree to which they are tightly integrated wholes varies. I'll get myself in trouble by saying something about Australia, and I'm not an expert on Australia, but Australia is not one of the most tightly integrated wholes among nations in the world. Australia is a country in which different states are significantly different and disconnected, and in which, in fact, Australians don't all travel all over Australia all the time. Australia has one of the lower rates of going to university outside your home state of the major countries that are divided this way. This doesn't mean Australia is not a country, but it means that the automatic assumption about wholeness needs to be questioned, that Australia has significant, right, subdivisions in that. So does the US, right? So do other places. Some countries are much more centralized and have organized a tighter level of wholeness. They don't have separate states. All of the policy in various areas is made at the central national government. My point is not to say one of these is better or worse, but to say it's a variable. And that the things that we want to describe as just either or, you have sovereignty, you don't, tend to be more variable. And what varies is not just whether there is some other big country that might bully you, whether China's next door or something. What varies is even how tightly you're organized internally in terms of that. All right? Boundaries are not fixed. They shift and change over time. They get renegotiated. Countries mostly try to keep them as fixed as they can, but there's a little bit more fluidity than we would expect. if we believed in a strong theory of sovereignty. Yet sovereignty is often what people want to defend. So, Britain must reclaim its sovereignty from the EU, right? It must be strong, right? There are also different ideas of sovereignty, though. Do we speak of the sovereignty of the people, popular sovereignty, a very important part of the democratic tradition, that the people rule in the country, or do we speak of the sovereignty of the state? And one of the tensions is, externally, we often speak of the sovereignty of the state, and then internally we say, well, we really mean the sovereignty of the people. But they're in a certain tension with each other, right? What does it mean to be independent? Is this an expression of the will of the people, or is this the celebration of the autonomy of a state, which, like North Korea, might actually be pretty autonomous from its own people too, right? Hardly an expression of national will and popular sovereignty in various ways. And no accident that the expressions, the Scottish picture is an expression of a bunch of people pretty peaceably waving flags in the context of the Scottish referendum, right? The North Korean example is, it is soldiers marching. There is a military project, both internal to the country and externally, a different way of thinking about this. Now, last year was a sort of great year if you're into nationalism. It really got front page attention and part of a major renewal. And Brexit and then Donald Trump are part of it. This is, of course, biographical for me since I managed to be in Britain, still working there when Brexit happened, and then in the United States taking a new job when Donald Trump got elected. So back to Trevor's introduction, you've got to worry about my influence in your political system. Well, I'm not going to ask you how you feel about, what does Donald Trump call him, Trimble? About Turnbull. But the Trumbull, whatever it was, I knew it was a mispronunciation. The issues, right, appear in these two cases famously, but they appear lots and lots of other places as well. And that's because there are problems in people's experiences of globalization, and they are looking to nationalists for solutions to those problems. It's not just a sort of suddenly everybody felt nationalist. It is they hope that nationalist policies and their governments can do some work for them in various ways. Now, nationalism didn't just get renewed last year. Right? There are a variety of ways in which it's being renewed in the world by some very different figures and in very different valences. Right? But Narendra Modi saying, I am a Hindu nationalist, right? And celebrating with a party. He's actually there campaigning for for a potential supporter to win an electoral campaign. Right? This is Hindu nationalism. It's not just Indian nationalism. It is a claim that Hindus are more properly Indian than Muslims, among other things. And that ran back to my earlier comment in the illusions that one of the illusions is that there is some clear, obvious way to decide who is normal and who fits properly into the nation. Nationalist campaigns are often campaigns for one definition of who fits properly to be dominant. And the BJP is a strong example of that, but there are various around the world. They also may have international agendas. A lot of the story of Vladimir Putin's nationalism is international as well as domestic, right? He has agendas domestically for this, but he also has the agenda that Russia should be seen as strong and important in the world and overcome the humiliation that was created with the crisis of the Soviet Union. So that part of the story is for international people to respect Russia. There are different agendas in different nationalists. The renewal of nationalism, all of these examples, is possible because of the banal examples, right? You can have the strong, forceful case because you have the postage stamps, because it's always already there to talk in terms of the nation, because that's how we organize the Olympics, because that's how we organize a whole variety of representative processes, that it's available then and familiar to everybody as a tactic. It wouldn't work for politicians if it weren't already familiar. It's an available thing, particularly in many ways in the modern era. It's pretty distinctively modern. At the same time, as I hinted earlier, there are a lot of problems that cannot be solved by one nation alone. All right? Whatever you think of the issue of refugees and migration, right? It's a global issue. It's not just one country's issue. Now, countries try to take hold of it in national terms, and politicians say things like, we have a refugee problem, sort of forgetting the refugees are coming from somewhere, and that the policies and the arrangements for handling this could be organized by international cooperation, right? But there's a tendency to often try to take hold of it in national terms, and it doesn't work terribly effectively, right? So this appears as a problem that nations experience but can't solve, right? Containerized cargo, the global trade system, stabilization of global trade, big issue for a variety of countries. You may benefit from it, maybe on the good side of it, but you can't really control it. And the financial versions of this global trade, even less, and countries may find themselves on the wrong side of currency arbitrage issues. You know, George Soros decides to go against you or something. And smuggling, the lower right picture, you know. I don't know about your croissants, but mine usually don't carry that much money in them, right? But the smuggling of money or guns or drugs or people, right, is a global issue that countries try to take hold of by enforcing their borders, by keeping the bad stuff out in some way. But I think it's safe to say that the experience of much of the modern world is that none of these national responses fully deal with the international problems. And there are more of these international problems. Think climate change, right? That's not an Australian glacier, but it's an Australian problem. And it's a problem for all of us if we have rising sea levels and global warming, right? Terrorism, right? The other versions of not just smuggling, but of drugs and guns and the global trade. I would say really the way to think about this is illicit capitalism. Something like a fifth, maybe more, of global capitalism is illegal, right? It either involves products that are illegal, you're not supposed to take drugs across borders and things, or it involves tax evasion, right? Or it involves enforcement tactics, like, hey, let's have a good contract. By the way, I'll shoot you if you don't sign, right? So about, right, a fifth, maybe a quarter of global capitalism, it's in the nature of this that there are no good statistics on it, is illegal. Well, the illegal is particularly, what it means to be illegal is governments cannot control it, right? The very definition here is national law isn't able to manage. Either things get across the border, they don't get taxed, or something else goes wrong. Lower right-hand corner is an evocation of the cyber attacks. This is actually one of the world's biggest monitors of cyber attacks, cyber warfare, cyber crime, cybersecurity issues, which people talk about just in short as cyber. You know, you're worried about cyber, right? Well, cyber means all the bad stuff. It used to mean cyberspace and science fiction novels and good things were happening. It's the negative story now of risks, like what we saw in the last week of the ransomware attacks, but there are all manner. This picture, right, is one day's cyber attack traffic, one day. The number of incidents. Now, none of those incidents was globally destabilizing, but what it shows you is there's a huge amount of illicit attack traffic going on at any time. And sometimes it's coming more from one country or another, or targeting one or another. But the bottom line, again, is it's hard to think that the countries are autonomous and sovereign in a world where that can go on. Now, this doesn't make us say, yeah, okay, never mind. Some people say, right, we should just have globalization, let's have global government. Most people say, I want my country to work better, right? I actually do think it's a problem when people smuggle drugs into the country, and therefore, I want the system to work better. We don't feel that we have an adequate global system without countries, in which Interpol or something will just take care of this. And so for each of these 8 different dimensions that I evoked of global problems, right, we have agencies and organizations working on global solutions. Most of them are actually agreements among countries. Interpol is not just a separate global police force. It is actually an organized relationship among the world's national police forces, right? The United Nations, contrary to myth, does not have its own military. and is not likely to invade anyone. If it ever has military operations, it's by virtue of the member states of the United Nations choosing to have them, and some countries volunteering to send soldiers and some willing to pay, right? So it's not autonomous. It is a creature of its nations. Globalization embeds countries in systems they can't manage. Our main response to that most of the time is to feel uneasy. As most of us, most of the time, don't think we know the solution to these problems, but they make us a bit nervous. Some people respond to that nervousness by becoming globalists and saying, let's strengthen the United Nations. Others respond to that nervousness by saying, America first. Let's have fewer dealings with foreigners. Or, indeed, Australia first. And the 20th century, right, saw a very difficult history, which we sometimes narrate in unreasonable ways, right? Just speaking of global systems, it's not all new, right? During the period when there was a struggle between the so-called Western allies, Britain, the United States, and so forth, the Axis powers, Eastern allies, China, Germany and Japan and so forth, for who is going to be the leading force in the world, we saw 2 world wars and a Great Depression. We go through a long period of a very tangled history in this. The same time, right, empire is still expanding at the beginning of the 20th century, right? But then by the middle of the 20th century, it is being eliminated as a basic mode of international organization. Part of what was going on is that for a while, Britain tried to manage those kinds of problems as problems of empire. Famine in Bengal, case for the empire, not case for the United Nations. And we see a shift towards having nothing but nations and agreements among nations over time. The world system, the so-called capitalist world system economically, is organized in terms of a global economy and national governments. It's a hybrid structure in which national governments create the legal frameworks, do the enforcing, and often help out their companies in a global economy. So we have a very complex mix. And most of the international organizations that we think about, like United Nations, World Bank, IMF, are actually interstate agreements among countries. Not always all countries, sometimes just certain countries. The global institutions, right, institutionalize a degree of equality and participation along with a lot of inequality. In this, they are exactly like national legislatures, right? Not all Australians have equal power, but there is a sort of one vote, one person, one vote system, and a, at least officially, equal representation in government. But alongside this, you know, there are corporations and there are interests and there are people who have more influence than others. And the same thing goes on internationally in even more striking degree, right, in all kinds of organizations. One of the basic problems we live with now is that the main global organizations were created in the wake of World War II, which gave people an impetus to think we need a United Nations, we need a World Bank, we need the IMF, and they enshrined a power structure from that time. Obviously, the world's big and powerful countries are Britain and France, right? Not China. And so China has been kept out of the governance structure of the World Bank, right? And only recently, and in a very marginal way, included in the IMF, okay? Small wonder that China creates the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is not just China, quote, being nationalistic, right? This is the Western powers unable to innovate to find a way to include the rising economies of Asia in the set of global institutions that are supposed to manage global finance and global economic activity and the eradication of poverty and other sorts of programs. So we are complicit in various ways in this system not working, right? My own cynical account of it in the World Bank case is it's not just some sort of anti-Chinese bias, it's that the tacit system is well, you always have an American director, and you always have a British vice president, and you always have, right, that there are spoils, that there's patronage systems going on, and nobody is willing to say, if we let the Chinese come in and be a vice president, who gives up their claim on being a vice president, right? That is a significant part of it. There are other problems too, governance terms. There was an ideology, particularly in the 90s, it hasn't gone away, but it's on hard times now, that we should move past all of this to a kind of cosmopolitan democracy, a global governance system that represented everybody around the world in a common system. I have elsewhere, and on many occasions and in writing, sort of said there were a lot of fantasies in this and a lot of failures to really examine the power structure on which it rested. Simple examples can be given, and I'm just going to evoke it, right? But I want to stress there are a lot of positive ideals here. People are saying the existing system of interstate relations doesn't represent some very large portions of the world's population very well, and it often doesn't solve problems very well. I think those are both true, right? But, right, the experience that underpins this cosmopolitan account of the world can be pretty misleadingly presented. Right? So James Bond is there. Just sort of note that part of the cosmopolitan, suave and debonair, wearing good Italian suits, not the cheap one like I have, the cosmopolitan hero, right, happens to be a Secret Service agent of Britain in this, and of the British Empire at that point, when Ian Fleming is writing these stories. Cosmopolitan is also a drink. You may remember from Sex and the City, this is what the girls like to drink. There is a version of cosmopolitanism, this theory, this actually benign, good idea that we ought to have more world government, that is rooted in consumerism. I'm a cosmopolitan. I know how to use chopsticks. I know how to order food. I might even be able to order food in 3 different languages. I can't actually have a conversation in any of those languages, but I can order some food, right? That there is a consumerist cosmopolitanism in which those people with enough money to pay for it are able to participate in global culture, right? And this underpins an idea of we're all one world, this all works fine, if we don't ask hard questions, like what credit cards you use to pay for that, and whether most of the people in Africa or Malaysia have those credit cards, and what's going on in material foundations of this. Nations participated in this too. They promoted themselves in all of this in a variety of ways, often seeking investment, but in various ways. This is actually a real ad that Germany ran for a number of years with Claudia Schiffer, and had various versions of scantily dressed models in German flags, and intended to attract you to that. There is a booming industry of nation branding, of marketing consultancy firms that work for countries. They started out in an industry that worked for consumer products. So you want to sell Hershey candy bars, you get somebody to help you build the brand. Well, it turns out that's extendable to national projects, right? You get the Olympics, you're going to get a branding agency that works on how to sell this. You get various versions of this in different countries. Not the main point, but the nations are being sold globally. Well, this is in a market which has a variety of stakes and payoffs. It's not actually doing very much for local Germans, right? But it is doing something for German corporations and investment structures and all of this. Maybe it's making the local Germans proud, right? As I suggested, there are ways in which people inhabit this cosmopolitan world, what I've called the class consciousness of frequent travelers. Like all class consciousnesses of elites is something people don't think they have. They think they represent the whole, but they often represent a slice of the whole. And in this case, the people have passports. Just think about it. If you have a passport from Australia, from the United States, from France, you can go almost anywhere and not be detained at immigration. On the other hand, try doing the same thing with a passport from the Central African Republic or the Sudan, right? It doesn't work as well. And so our apparently borderless cosmopolitan world is full of all of these obstacles for many people in the world. It isn't really as fair as is suggested. And part of what underpins this is the idea that it's all one thing, rather than that, hey, the cultural and the economic are in some tension with each other here. Okay? Many people in this era of this is actually from just at the beginning of this century, begin to give accounts in which they essentially start blaming the non-cosmopolitans, the nationalists, the fundamentalists, all those bad people who don't have the positive attitude that cosmopolitans have towards human rights and towards global values. Catch here is not that I disagree about human rights or global values, it's that they're forgetting that this isn't a level playing field, that people don't just have different attitudes because they got up one morning and changed their minds, right? That they're in very different circumstances in the world. And so Tony Giddens, my good friend, and actually my predecessor at the LSE, I think is both right and very problematic in this statement. He's right. I think the world does face these conflicts. He's wrong to think it's just a matter of the attitudes of people and not be more sociological and looking at how it's grounded in social organization, economic organization, so forth. Let me take us back to what I said at the beginning. Nations are not simply inherited, right? They are not just always already there. They are constantly being remade. They develop in a history. The history goes on today. We participate in shaping the future of our nations. And we have choices. Our nations can live and be creative and be renewed, and they can do good things. We can say we want our national solidarity to underpin a project of the redistribution of wealth in which the poor and disadvantaged get a better share, a more fair share of the national wealth. We want our national solidarity to underpin a healthcare system that makes sure everybody gets the care that they need. We want our national solidarity to underpin an educational system which is available free of charge to every citizen of the country to be able to advance their ability to participate in an ever more complex and changing world, okay? Or not. We can say, our focus is not any of those solidarities. Our focus is keeping those bad foreigners out. Our focus is making sure that the government of our country defends our private property against those other people who want a share of it. It's up to us to decide how to make nations. Now, on a global stage, right, this matters enormously. Are we making our nations able to confront climate change? Able to work cooperatively with others on the migration problems? Able to actually manage the illicit capitalism that is affecting all of us all the time? Or not, right? This is a choice. It's not an inheritance. It's not a, oh, bad luck, I live in a racist nation. It's what can I do to change the nation? And this is the important illusion that you can't do anything because it's just natural. The important reality that, yes, things can be done. Nations don't just sit there. They're engaged, they're mobilized in solving various problems. We can lead them towards better problem solving. We can ignore the question and just see what happens. We can be pernicious. They're never just by themselves. They exist partly because others exist. There's no first nation in a literal sense. There might be First Nations in the Canadian sense, but it's always plural, right? The whole idea has relations among others. You can't draw a border that is not a border between two or more countries in all of this. We need to engage in this world. It might become a world of global cosmopolitanism in which it's no longer organized in nations, but that's pretty far off, I would say. For the foreseeable future, I'm old, it's easy for me to say for my lifetime, but for yours too, and you're young, we're going to have nations. The challenge is to make us have good nations that do good, not retreats from a risky world, but resources for engaging the world. Nations have, in varying degrees, some are poor, some are rich, have resources for engaging. We need to be helpful in this. We need to help our countries be engaged in positive projects of self-understanding. Right? People need to be able to understand how they fit into the world. Nations are part of that story, but only if we take up the opportunity, the potential that is available in it. We can articulate higher values. We often do articulate higher values. We just don't connect them to our actions as well as we might. We establish solidarity, right? We provide public goods in varying degrees. I'm going fast because we're near the end here, so I apologize that I'm doing that, but the headline says it. We can create national solidarity, we can use the national solidarity to create public goods, or not. We can take on the challenge of diversity, in which nations can be not the problem but an advantage, because assimilation is assimilation into something and somewhere, because cooperation can be better organized or not. So we either create that capacity for diversity or not, but wishing the nation away doesn't really solve the problems of multiculturalism or diversity. It's a deeply interdependent world. We really need to tackle international and domestic problems, but we tackle them best through making nations work better, through grasping the future as a project, not just as our fate. Nations matter. It's up to us to make ours better or worse. Thank you.
Oh, you have many,
How much
many
overtime did I run?
No, that's good. We got many questions, but only a limited amount of time in which to ask them. So please make them as concise as possible. Put your hand up so we can see. Yep, over here.
Thanks for the great lecture. I guess your lecture had two main components. One, that the disappearing of a nation is neither happening nor is desirable. With the first part, that it actually is happening, I guess that you have some illustrations to show that it's safe and sound. It's not going to disappear very soon. But there are challenges and counter forces. I guess both sides have illustrations and indications and examples to give. I wonder if one wants to conduct an empirical project to measure forces and counter forces to settle this debate, what are the variables that must be measured to have a response to this debate?
I think that's a great question. My answer will be imperfect. The question is, what would we need to measure to decide whether nations were getting stronger or weaker in the world? The first thing that would be part of this empirical project is we'd have to recognize that there are different nations in different positions. So my talk and almost all writings about this tend to speak about nations in general. But of course, as I hinted, Central African Republic or Liechtenstein and People's Republic of China or US are not in the same place. So there are very powerful countries and there are less powerful countries, and that already is giving us a clue. The military power and or the political power, relatively speaking, is one such variable or two such variables. Economic influence is another. Capacity to control the policy making economically or in other areas is an important variable that we compare. To what extent can the country on its own set that? I tried to illustrate the problem by pointing to Greece, where Greece is not able to set a range of domestic policies, not able to, is in a difficult situation for dealing with refugees because of the way the rest of Europe has related to Greece and the way global financial markets are related to Greece. But there are all sorts of variations. That's part of what you would want to know. For essentially every possible policy area, you would want to know to what extent the country was able to set and really live by and enforce its own policies. You would find that in no case for no country is it perfectly. It would, there's no country that gets 100% on this, but some get more than others. You would also, though, want to know to what extent does the country get what it wants by cooperation. Okay? So if you thought the only way in which countries got success in any policy area was through things they did by themselves, you would be missing all the ways in which there is global cooperation, and actually countries may be stronger or may get more of what they want through cooperating with the whole world or with their neighbors or in some other group. And there are all kinds of groups, the European Union, groups that join free trade agreements, and so forth. So how effective are countries in managing interrelations, and to what extent does their own internal success in their policy depend on those international relations rather than things they do by themselves? So this is a sort of short hint at an answer, but that's where I would go to try to look for an account of the extent to which this is working or not. But one last point which is one reason I feel confident in predicting that even if nations face these big problems and have trouble in a way in the world, they aren't going to go away. I don't say they're going to be just fine. They're still going to be troubled, but they're not going to go away, is because there's not a clear alternative. I actually don't think there is a program of global governance that is available that has any level of support to supplant the nation-state system, and we don't easily give something up without knowing what we're going to get in its place.
Go ahead. Yep.
You talked about using nations for good and to create effective outcomes. I assume that's part of what you do. Sorry, that's part of what you do at the Berggruen Institute. But is that as simple as promoting engagement between nations, or are there more kind of structural approaches?
So I hope that's something that we're able to make work on. I've only been doing the Berggruen Institute for 8 months, and I have not solved any major global problem whatsoever. So I don't want to take an unwarranted amount of credit, but that is exactly the kind of thing we think. So let me just put it in 3 terms relating to the Berggruen Institute, but to the challenges in the world. First, in order to do a very good job, we have to be able to think about these issues well. So part of our agenda is to say, what new concepts do we need, what new theories, how do we get the capacity to be able to think and understand issues that are going on, because there are new issues among countries. So I gave the examples that we know about with climate change and global finance. What about regulation of gene editing? We've got these amazing new technologies to be able to transform human beings. We have not even begun thinking through what definition of the human we think needs to underpin any kind of international regulation of these things. So we need to work on these sorts of things. That's one, thinking. 2, governance. We need to be able to have ways of translating this into practical action. So I think that the dilemma that I just evoked, rather than went into detail on by commenting on the World Bank not being able to incorporate China effectively, is a very basic issue. That our governance institutions are out of date. I think it's an issue inside countries, by the way, too, that we often have governance institutions that have passed their sell-by date, and we haven't reformed and innovated as much as we should have. We need institutions that work much better. A specific example of that in the global arena is we don't have good ways of drawing corporations into our thinking about governance. We think that governance is all an issue among nation states, but in fact there are many global corporations that are more powerful than many nation states, and we haven't, even at the level of thought, let alone real action, worked out what to do about that. Google and Apple and companies like this are enormously powerful around the world. The third thing, and that's something we work on at Berggruen, the third thing is China as an example, but it could be other places in the world too. China is the most important example of a new rising power that we deal with in various ways from other countries, but often in just transactional ways, in very superficial ways, like, oh, we want to have a trade agreement about not doing something in trade, not with a very strong ability to look at the world from a Chinese point of view. And so one of the things we work on at the Berggruen Institute is to try to strengthen the way in which China is included into and Chinese points of view are understood in looking at any of these problem areas, that we're not just having an American conversation or a Western conversation, but part of our project, we have Beijing office and all, is to try to ensure that there are Chinese conversations and that those become part of the global conversation.
Craig, in your first book on nationalism, you had a very useful typology. I think it was a tripartite one. I can only remember 2 now. But one of them was that nationalism as discourse and nationalism as project. And you had another one I can't remember. But I found it
inheritance, which I said was the bad one. Yeah.
It's a very useful way of thinking about many of the Asian nations in our region forged themselves as revolutionary resistance to colonization, and then imposed on their own peoples a uniformity of nationalist discourses about nation-building projects.
Yeah.
What I don't quite get is, why do we need nationalist discourses when it often means the obliteration of cultural difference, linguistic difference, regional differences within the nation-state territory? Why can't we have a post-nationalist concept of citizenship, which is nation building but without the discourse of nationalism, because it often ends up being a familial ideology of the patrimonial families running the place.
So I fully endorse the idea of having better versions of a unifying discourse. What I want to say is that those would be better versions of being a nation. That as of now, when you say post-national, but then you say nation at the same time, and what I'm saying is just talking in terms of nations is already nationalism. That it's entirely possible to have a completely post-national discourse, but what would be the ways in which that translated into better policies? Right? I think the ways it would translate into better policies are to get national governments to enact the better policies, and that within nations, especially democratic nations, we have the potential to have influence and to say we want policies that do not just enshrine the privilege of elites, but that recognize the full range of peoples, and that we want to be, in that sense, a country that recognizes itself as a fully multicultural nation that recognizes the rights of everyone and so forth. What worries me about the idea of the post-national, which is commendable in many ways, is that it has no social or political economic base. It is saying that if we somehow just have a free-floating change, that it will work. And it seems to me we need to change institutions. We need to change material arrangements and conditions. And the most leverage we have to do that is often through existing states and seeking to have the states that we are part of, where we are national members, be better. Now, I fully admit that others could approach that other ways. Some people would say, no, we've got to build a global governance system and get rid of all the nations. I think that's A, unrealistic, B, likely to produce chaos and conflict, and C, likely to be an invitation to new power structures rather than new structures of equality and harmony. So it doesn't look as attractive to me in real world terms as it looks as in terms of ideals.
Okay. John.
In relation to the question of whether nations are getting stronger or not, I think one important issue is legitimacy. The EU tried to make itself legitimate in a way that would replace people's attachment to their own countries. We've had eruptions in the opposite direction. The EU has almost completely failed in that enterprise. Trump has appealed to a very large degree to Americans' sense that your government is illegitimate, your state is illegitimate. I want to bring legitimacy back. Now, all of that suggests that there's some sort of yearning or need in people to belong to an entity which they feel is legitimate, and that, without question, completely in agreement with what you've been saying, is the nation state. Now, if there is such a yearning, for want of a better word, that needs, in terms of your optimistic conclusion, that needs tapping into in a way that won't lead to what happened in the earlier 20th century.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I almost just say I agree. I think that people who want to have what you called my optimistic conclusion, who want to have an optimistic idea about a fairer future in all of this, need to connect that to the production of legitimacy. I think that many who might call themselves on the left or something have undermined their own ability to call on their fellow nationals in many countries by rejecting any engagement in so-called nationalist discourse. Also by rejecting religion and family, and that's so that in a variety of ways the left has disempowered itself by well-motivated, well-meaning attempts to get away. Well, we can't talk about family, that's patriarchal. We can't talk about religions, or A, we've got multiple religions, but B, that's all bad because we shouldn't believe in God, it's supernatural or something. Nations, same way. I think in many ways a kind of rationalist liberal individualism took over for the so-called left and was against many of these institutional orders because it was thought they could be oppressive. But then it leaves us in a very difficult place when we're calling on fellow citizens to join the project and we don't have a legitimacy granting account. And I include myself in this. There are all sorts of things I haven't liked about my nation's positions on various things. But I completely agree, and I think I now regret not saying anything about it, but I talked too long. Legitimacy is crucial, and part of the reason why I answer Trevor in saying I don't think it's so easy to be post-national, is that I don't think it's so easy to produce a replacement for the work that nations and nationalism do in producing legitimacy, what I called solidarity, feeling we're in it together. If you want to have any kind of redistributive policy, for example, or you want to get people in cities to care about the policy for rural areas, there needs to be some way in which we are accounting for being all in this together. And just saying, well, we can all vote and, is a thin soup for that. And I think we need a stronger account of belonging in it together to underwrite sharing. But the legitimacy part is crucial. I will say with regard to Europe quickly that I agree with everything you said, but I think Europe got stuck at a midpoint in which it did not go the direction of trying to create a European-wide nation state, and it really didn't embrace the level of a Europe of the nations with high levels of devolved autonomy and only some authority at the whole. It got caught in the middle, offering and proposing different levels of integration in the cultural, the political, and the economic spheres. And those came to be in tension with each other and came to be problematic. So, Europe was way better at integration of capital and better for businesses than it was at some other parts of the integration project. And it was, it had governance challenges over the euro that involved an incomplete political integration and so forth. So while I agree with it being broken and not working in all these ways, I think part of how it got broken is that it got to an impasse where some people wanted to go further to a more complete harmonization, which would have been something like a supranational Europe that was, to all intents and purposes, a nation state. Yet, I don't remember the number, but the vast majority of Europeans still watch the news in their national language. That there is this considerable continuity of national identities, even among people who consider themselves also European, both and in a way, around 2006 or so.
When Britain leaves Europe, English is going to remain the working language of Europe.
Yeah.
And that shows what a fast the enterprise is on that level.
Well, it shows what contradictions it lives with. I'm not willing to say a farce. It seems, though I am generally critical, and so I'm not on a completely different side here, I think that it's stuck on some contradictions that have not been worked through and probably never will be, because I'm not very optimistic about this. But there were possible paths. It's not that the idea of a European Union is a terrible idea. There are a variety of decisions. So trying simultaneously to intensify integration and to enlarge the EU intensified a contradiction in Europe that was really a deep problem. Europe could have decided in a smaller range of nations it was going to intensify integration, or with an enlarged Europe it was going to have a looser knit federation, but it was unable to make either of those choices and got sort of stuck in the middle, it seems to me. And that's a sign of how problematic the political processes are, I agree. But I'm unwilling to go so far as to say that it's just a farcical bad idea. I think that it had some pretty good and important purposes and some positive effects, and like most of politics, is a big disappointment.
Adrian.
Yeah. I think you've argued very well why nations matter and what the legitimacy. But I'm sceptical about the juxtaposition between cosmopolitanism and nation, because I think there's a third element in the triangle, and that's the city. And what we're seeing is that there are certain global forces that are really anchored on great imperial corporate cities, and these are always bigger than their nations, and that in many ways the confidence, you appeal for the nation state to be able to grab this, and that's probably the only key way to the governance way. But I think we're looking at this thing in the balance, that these global imperial corporate entities, roam on, are hard to manage. I think a very key kind of indicator here was that the G7 finance ministers announced their intention to try to restrict global tax avoidance.
Okay.
And we're yet to see, and clearly that's in the interests of each nation state, and yet we're yet to see any progress. In this country, we're grappling with gas policy and fundamentals that are, and it's very much in the balance as to whether the nation state is capable of. So it seems to me that the cosmopolitanism isn't just like nation and cosmopolitanism. There was always a sense in some great imperial global corporate cities, Atlanta, New York, they're resented by their own nations.
Sure.
And that, and in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne axis, that's not exactly hugely popular anywhere else in the country.
Sure.
And so, to me, what we're seeing is a sense in which sometimes the city may be ungovernable now.
So I'm not sure. It may be, or it may be that urban governance works better than national governance in some places. I think there's a school of thought that says cities are often doing a job of solving problems that larger countries aren't. But I think the question's open. I don't have the answer to it. So you ask a really good question, or a package of questions. I'll just try to respond really briefly to a couple of them. One, I agree that cities are important and are not reducible to just bits of the nations they're in. I think that
Only some cities, like
yeah,
you know,
certain major cities, the global cities that some people write about and so forth. And it's an open question how far in that list you go. So all right, there are London counts, but then you go on down the list. Does Manchester count? Does Birmingham count? And the cities are extremely important. Cities are engines of economic growth. In a way, nations are just categories in relation to economic growth. As such, they don't do the economic growing. They sometimes do redistribution, they do taxation, they do various policies and manage the context for the cities. But most of the economic growth in the world is in urban projects these days. So in general, I agree, they're really important. Now, and I agree with the observation that in many countries, there is a split between the economy of leading globally oriented cities and the rest of the country. That's part of the story of Brexit, London and Manchester versus the rest of the country. The question is what to do with that. Do you say, therefore, London and Manchester should secede, Sydney and Melbourne should secede? Not a realistic project, although it might feel good to say it for a few people. Or do you say, this is a reflection of a pattern of unequal economic development that is deeply problematic because it also is what has produced growing domestic inequality in almost every OECD country, where we've had just huge increases of inequality in many cases. And we need to do something about the inequality and about the way in which so-called neoliberal capitalism has driven that unequal development, which has benefited cities, but it's also benefited classes and created problems of social integration. And it actually links back to legitimacy because part of the problem is the social cohesion of countries is sort of damaged when there's that level of inequality, and it has not only a class form, but a geographic form and other forms. And nations, I think, nation states, are almost the only organizational unit able to give some resistance to those forces of economic development that are producing such unequal outcomes and driving lots of other negative features globally. So my answer to this comes back to that's why we need to pay attention to the nation. We need to rebuild the integration. But if we treat it as just a cultural or an ethical problem, or just politics even, and don't pay attention to the economic underpinnings, then we won't be able to do much. We will still have this divergence between Sydney and Melbourne, and a debate about whether Perth counts in that, and a bunch. And it will get reflected in every other sector too, because then there'll be a debate about universities in the same terms, and there'll be a debate about other things. Because we've become a society in which inclusion is so hierarchically organized, with some benefiting more than others, that we don't do a very good job with inclusion on non-hierarchical bases. And yet countries are, I think, the unit in which we could do that. We could create greater solidarity. We could redistribute. We could use national policy and resources to try to create some growth in some other places. It's not easy, and I don't pretend to have all the answers to that. I would add the other, there's a parallel. There's another thing besides cities that stand outside this easy thing, and that's corporations, which are also, as I suggested, huge forces, and they don't fit neatly into the categories of nationalism and cosmopolitanism or something like that. It's not that we say, you know, oh, that Apple, it's a wonderful company, it's so cosmopolitan because it's selling computers all over the world. It is, in a sense, and in fact, one of the most basic meanings of cosmopolitanism today would have to be the way in which capitalist markets are extending all over the place globally. We have more unity of the world in terms of capitalist markets than we have in terms of political collaboration or even culture. But that may not be the unity that we were hoping to celebrate with the term cosmopolitanism. But the same thing again, I don't know that we have a great deal of ability to regulate or shape the futures of these most powerful corporations, but if we do, it's from nation states. And it's not that the World Social Forum by itself is going to accomplish that in some way. So I come back to the same thing, and it's fair to call that my optimistic conclusion, but it's a grasping for an optimistic conclusion because I really don't think it's going to be easy for countries, and it's hard enough for Australia or the US or France. What is it for Malawi to try to do all of this? So it's not that all nation states automatically have tremendous resources for tackling the issues of inequality, neoliberal capitalism, corporate power in the world. But if there is an organized unit that could potentially do that, it has to be nations, I think.
Thank you. Before we conclude, I'd like to do some thank yous, and I would ask Pam, please come up the front as well. In the past week, we have been privileged to share in some conversations and engage in creative and critical thinking in conversation with Pam and Craig. And if you've been beneficiaries of attending either of the events that they have been public speaking, you will know what I'm talking about, that cosmopolitanism is more than consumption, that it actually crosses borders and opens up issues, and we can commit ourselves to longer term projects, but they're based in modest connections. And Peter, if you could come up please too. I think the start of the relationship was in fact the friendship between Peter and Craig. It started at the American Sociological Association. Was that what the...
No, it started at La Trobe University.
Yeah, it was one of the working groups of the social theory or historical sociology back in...
Together in Miami.
We were together in Miami. That was not where we first met or where this started.
Okay, so from small beginnings, we've continued the conversation over several decades. So I'd like you to say thank you to these people first. Some thank yous to sponsors. The 50th anniversary of La Trobe University happened at a very good time for us, and we were able to get some sponsorship from the Office of the Vice Chancellor, and also a vote from the Pro-Vice Chancellor of our College of Arts, Social Sciences and Commerce, Professor Tony McGrew. And Thesis 11 Journal, which is not actually part of La Trobe University, has also been a key sponsor for all of these events. But there's been a number of people who have rallied forth when I moved around the university and telling them about the present visits. I'd like to thank the people from the research focus area, Building Healthy Communities, particularly Alan Shield, the director, and Lindis Conlon, who was the project officer. I'd like also to thank the folks in the RFA Transforming Human Societies, and the director, Katie Holmes, and particularly Raylene Wilding as well in the Mobilities and Migrations Research Cluster, and also Katie again as the new director of the Centre for the Study of Inland and Julie Rudner, who's at Bendigo campus for some of the regional events as well. So thanks to all those people for rallying forth, because you've made it possible against some of the fossilisation of our bureaucracy. This has been an extraordinary week in which the repercussions and working throughs of what we've been talking and discussing will continue through our networking and through our institutions, but also through our discourses and our publications. So thank you very much. Before we close, however, I asked Peter to say a quick word about a man who's been very, very important to us here at La Trobe University and across the international conversations in humanities and social sciences as well.
I have to try and keep this upbeat. Right? Thesis 11 is nearly 40 years old. We're doing well, we're doing fine. We're doing good. There's lots of energy, there's lots of young folk, there's lots of ideas, there's lots of work to be done. But you know, with the passing of times, we lose people. And I'm afraid, you know, it's a list that's going to grow. Recently, we've lost George Marcush, we've lost Zig Barman. Sorry, lost Joel. So I ask you all together, please, to raise an imaginary glass to Joel. Come. Here's Joel. Come. Thanks.